Hi everyone, this is the first part of my three-part sequence on international economics. In this video, we'll be discussing issues associated with calculating net exports, otherwise known as the trade balance. In subsequent videos, we'll discuss exchange rates and the economic impact of impediments to free trade. Of course, you can always email me if you have any questions on this material. When it comes to net exports, one thing that we are surely interested in is the trading of goods and services between the U.S. and foreign countries. But another thing that we should take into consideration when we think about international trade is financial trade flows. We know from the previous chapters that the four components to GDP are household consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports. We also learned that expansionary monetary policy is associated with an increase in the money supply, which leads to lower interest rates and therefore an increase in spending by households and companies. However, what we haven't discussed yet so far is how all of this affects the value of the US dollar and ultimately net exports. With expansionary monetary policy, an increase in the amount of M1 will increase the amount of currency in the form of cash and coins, as well as money in checking accounts in the US. So expansionary monetary policy effectively increases the supply of money. Remember from our supply and demand chapter that an increase in supply with no change to demand leads to a lower equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. Applying this to our money example, having more money in the world will lower the equilibrium price of the US dollar, or in other words, the US dollar will be devalued. So one thing that is going to happen with expansionary monetary policy is that GDP increases due to households and companies taking out more loans to buy goods and services. But now, we'll take a look at how expansionary monetary policy also weakens the value of the US dollar, which makes American products relatively cheaper than foreign products, which will ultimately increase net exports as we export more of our relatively cheaper American products and import less of the relatively more expensive foreign products. To be sure, this is further strengthening the argument that the Fed could lower interest rates as one of the levers to boost the American economy. If the US didn't trade with other countries, we would be referred to as a closed economy. A fancy economics word for a closed economy is autarky. On the other hand, an open economy means that a country trades with other countries. You might recall from the supply and demand chapter that many economists would argue in favor of a completely free market with little to no government influence over our product markets. In other words, price controls could lead to disequilibrium, such as a shortage or a surplus. Similarly, many economists would argue that free trade would be the most ideal situation, such that there is little to no government influence over international trade. In part 3 of this three-part sequence, we'll discuss the economic impact of impediments to free trade, like tariffs and quotas. Before we look at the pros and cons of free trade, we need to take a look at the accounting side of measuring net exports. Macroeconomists have two ways of calculating net exports. One method is called the current account, and the other method is called the financial account. Let's go through these two methods to determine the value of net exports, starting with the current account. There are three components to the current account method. First, we include the trade balance, which is another word for net exports. As we know, net exports is simply exports minus imports. But then we're also going to take two other flows between trading partners into consideration: net investment income and unilateral transfers. One of my Ohio State professors had a checking account in a bank in Zimbabwe because his wife is from there. Unfortunately, Zimbabwe had suffered from hyperinflation, and so he would joke about how his money there was basically worthless. So the idea is that you could have US citizens having money stashed in foreign bank accounts such that they could be earning interest on their deposits in foreign banks. Similarly, someone from the UK could have bank accounts in the US and earn interest on the money that they have stashed in American banks. The difference between the interest earned by Americans in their bank accounts abroad and the interest earned by foreigners from American banks is called net investment income. Unilateral transfers is the foreign aid that the US donates to foreign countries. So if the US government donates money to fight poverty in Africa, then that would be an example of a unilateral transfer. Basically, this is money from the US going to other countries that we're not expecting to come back. This slide presents real-world values to the three components of the U.S. current account in 2011. First off, notice that the trade balance is negative since we imported more than we exported. Notice at the bottom that these numerical values are in billions of US dollars, so this means that the US had a trade deficit of nearly $560 billion in 2011. Looking at net investment income, Americans earned more than $738 billion in interest from foreign bank accounts, whereas foreign citizens earned about $517 billion from American financial institutions, so the net investment income in 2011 was positive $221 billion. The amount of foreign aid to other countries was around $134 billion, so the current account balance is negative $559.9 billion plus $221 billion minus $134.5 billion, which equals negative $473.4 billion. Keep this number in mind as we compare the number from the current account method and the financial account method. Let's take a deeper dive into the first component of the current account method, which is balance of trade, or in other words, net exports. If we export more than we import, then we would have a positive value for balance of trade, or a trade surplus. However, we saw in the previous slide that the U.S. imported more than we exported in 2011, resulting in a trade deficit or a negative balance of trade. If we take a look at data from the following year, we would see that the trade deficit increased from nearly $560 billion in the previous slide to $742 billion in 2012. In fact, we ran a trade deficit with every region of the world except for Latin America, excluding Mexico. We'll take a deeper dive into this in the next slide. Again, we're taking a look at 2012 data now. This is a US-centric figure, so the red arrows depict the amount of imports from various regions of the world, whereas green arrows depict the amount of exports to these different trading partners. There are some interesting trends to notice here. First, we ran a huge trade deficit with China, since we imported $427 billion, but only exported $112 billion to them in 2012. Also, Mexico is a particularly important trading partner, so this figure separates them from the rest of Latin America. In fact, the number associated with imports, or the red arrow, is greater than the number associated with exports, or the green arrow, for every trading partner except for Latin America, excluding Mexico. Let's focus on Japan. Notice we imported $149 billion of Japanese products in 2012, while exporting $72 billion. If we were to change this figure to be Japan-centric, then you would expect imports to the US to be $72 billion and exports to the US as $149 billion, right? Well, let's see if that's actually true. And it's not. You can see here that Japan is now the center of the figure, but this shows that exports to the US is $140 billion, while imports is $76 billion. Remember, these numbers should have been $149 billion and $72 billion, respectively, based on the US-centric graph. What's going on here? What we saw is a discrepancy in measuring trade flows between the same two trading partners. As with any real-world data, there's inevitably going to be some amount of reporting error during the data collection process. As we'll see in the next slide, this type of data entry error will be one of the components to the financial account method. The financial account method is also composed of three components like the current account method, but these three components are different. First, we incorporate the purchases of physical assets like buildings and properties, but also financial assets like bank deposits or bonds. Finally, we can see that there's a statistical discrepancy line item which accounts for the measurement error that we talked about in the previous slide. This table shows us the numerical values of the U.S. financial account in 2011. First, notice that there was a lot more foreign money coming in to buy American assets than American dollars used to buy foreign assets. Whereas the current account measures the value of the products that are being imported and exported between the U.S. and our trading partners, the financial account measures the amount of currency flowing between the U.S. and the rest of the world to pay for these transactions. At the end of the day, the current account and the financial account are measuring the same thing, trade flows. So the numbers should match up. In the previous slide, I mentioned that the value of the U.S. current account in 2011 was $473.4 billion. Here, notice that the value of the U.S. financial account in 2011 was also $473.4 billion. However, one of the ways that we get these numbers to match is the $80.5 billion associated with statistical discrepancy. To be sure, this accounting practice leaves me feeling a little uneasy because it's like using fuzzy numbers so we end up with the right answer. Nonetheless, this is how the measurement of international trade is done. Now that we've introduced issues associated with calculating the trade balance, you can now move on to part 2 of the 3-part sequence, which analyzes exchange rates. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have.